Hello and welcome to the Reorg, where we dive into the Satoshi Nakamoto Institute archives and re-examine old ideas after years of accumulated proof of work. This is your host, Michael Goldstein, also known as Bitstein, and joining me as always is my co-host, Pierre Rochard. Pierre, how are you doing?
Very well. How are you, Michael?
I'm doing well. We're actually coming to what I would say is sort of a climax of our journey through the S&I mempool crash course. Today we are talking about the infamous article that the image people will see on their screens if they're watching came from Hyperbitcoinization. So just wanted to give a recap first about what we've gone through so far. So we were going through the S&I mempool crash course in Bitcoin political economy, which we put together as a collection of articles from primarily the 2013 to 2015 era that basically covered a sort of the full scope of an argument as to why we believed that Bitcoin would overtake not just precious metals, but also fiat money to become the dominant global currency. And, so if you're brand new to listening, thank you for listening. But I do suggest starting at the beginning and making your way through all of the episodes and articles, because it is sort of meant to guide you through a full discussion leading up to effectively this main idea of hyperbitcoinization. So we talked a bit about the monetary policy of Bitcoin and its perfect monetary policy with a fixed supply and unchanging supply schedule, independent from any government policy. We talked about the sort of original value of Bitcoin and some of the fundamentals regarding the mining ecosystem and how it secures Bitcoin, as well as how the nodes operate within that as well. We talked about why Bitcoin is growing and why it's not merely a bubble, but actually has underlying monetary reasons to be growing, and why its growth is expected and why it would be growing at a rate that would make people think it's a bubble if they're not thinking clearly about it. We talked about hoarding and how the sort of main driver of appreciated values of Bitcoin comes from the hoarding of Bitcoins, and how saving increases the marginal value of all the other coins, especially when you have such a fixed supply schedule. And so that has effects on how it's going to grow, and kind of pushes back against some of the narratives that have a more spending focus of Bitcoin growth. But it also affects how we should be thinking about businesses operating in such an environment. Then we took some time to talk about altcoins, a number of articles about why altcoins ultimately fail to, in some cases, fail to capture Bitcoin's fundamental properties in a technological sense, but more importantly, that they all fail to capture it in a liquidity sense. And it's actually that liquidity rather than particular features that is sort of most important. So, having that liquidity and the strict scarcity and credible monetary policy to support that liquidity existing, that matters way more than mere blockchain technology or some kind of smart contracting feature, even if these things within Bitcoin actually do exist and do great things. Then we talked about volatility and how, Bitcoin's obviously a very volatile asset, but that is a sign of life and growth in the context of Bitcoin rather than a sign of inadequacy as to its value proposition. We talked about how Bitcoin's usage in the marketplace, while sometimes it's used in parts of the market that people find to be a burden on Bitcoin, should not necessarily be seen as a negative in the sense of holding Bitcoin back from what it actually is. So, Bitcoin is for enemies, and so just because other people use it in a way that you might not approve of, the fact that they can use it in those ways might indicate positive reasons why Bitcoin is actually better for you. And in any case, these things have empirically not slowed down the growth of Bitcoin. And so they simply shouldn't be used as arguments against Bitcoin, but rather just, are arguments for and against, your view of how people should live their lives, but not regarding Bitcoin itself. Then we talked about Bitcoin as a unit of account, because people tend to think of this as being sort of the last thing that Bitcoin becomes. They tell a story of Bitcoin being a store of value, then a medium of exchange, then a unit of account. But we presented a different sort of look at this that tied all of it back into a medium of exchange, which Bitcoin actually is. And from Bitcoin's use as a medium of exchange, that is a good that people want to acquire for the use of indirect exchange. It's always been, since it has had any price at all, it has been a phenomenal way to be doing your economic calculation, your profits and losses. And the people who have done that for all these years have done much, much better economically than those who haven't. So Bitcoin is and always has been the best unit of account, and it'll only become a better unit of account as Bitcoin continues to grow. Then we talked about, Pierre, your, probably the second most important article in this series. The second most influential, I would say. I don't want to choose my favorite babies and stuff like that. But as far as raw influence, the term hyperbitcoinization, I think, is so highly embedded in the broader Bitcoin world. But in some sense, the process which you describe in Speculative Attack is indeed a massive economic force, and arguably what is going to drive Bitcoin adoption, especially going forward now with the entrance of larger institutions buying Bitcoin and holding Bitcoin, and even using dollar leverage as a way to get more Bitcoin. And so, one of the most important articles there. And then we talked a bit about the ways in which people attack Bitcoin and try to control Bitcoin, and what Bitcoin has in order to defend itself, both in terms of its network governance, so how nodes make sure that people can't change the rules arbitrarily, but actually have to have the input, the buy-in from effectively every other node, which is and investor, which is highly unlikely in the case of wanting to change the monetary policy, especially when these things would require a hard fork, which would sort of implicitly or maybe even explicitly be creating a new currency, and thus not really Bitcoin as we previously knew it. So, but we also talked about sort of the incentive structures around how private keys and nodes make Bitcoin something where institutional engagement is on a much more it's of a much more voluntary nature, where people can pick and choose how they do or do not want to engage with these, unlike with fiat currencies and even precious metals with the need for various services for storage. And so Bitcoin, in that sense, it allows for more individualism where people want it, and where people want institutional services, they have much more that they can demand from those institutions. And finally, last time we talked about the ways in which Bitcoin's growth actually, and the time aspect of Bitcoin, and the fact that it stands as a principal agent problem for those who wish to attack Bitcoin. You're almost always better off just giving in to Bitcoin. Through those incentives, there's actually a lot of ways in which where people might think there's a natural desire to attack Bitcoin, in practice might actually not work out that way. And I think that's something that we've seen quite a bit in the way that governments have been way less malicious towards Bitcoin than many would have thought at the time of the writing of those articles. And, through all that, we get sort of, like I said, to the climax of Hyperbitcoinization by Daniel Krawisz, which was published on March 29th, 2014. The price was about $630. And a little prehistory on the concept before we dive into the article. So in 2013, there was a lot of discussion, obviously, about what Bitcoin is, how it would grow, and so on and so forth. And how does it affect an economy when you have such a interesting, nascent, and strict new money? And another Bitcoiner, Conrad Graf, had written some blog posts in 2013 about the concept of hypermonetization. And he was looking not at hyperinflation, but instead what happens when you just have a money that's so good and so useful that people start adopting it at a very fast rate. Can we expect it to be fast, and what would happen? And so this was something that was sort of being discussed. And he wrote a follow-up in November 2013 as well, Hypermonetization Reloaded, where he talked more about this. And, a big takeaway for him was that the way Bitcoin's growth is, it can look like a bubble because it's so rapid. And sometimes it even does get ahead of itself. But that doesn't mean that Bitcoin itself is a bubble. Instead, those rapid increases could be seen as a hypermonetization event rather than one of just sort of market hype and business cycles. So last thing I want to do before we hop into the article is I have this chart that I made. It's meant to be in the style of one of those St. Louis Federal Reserve economic data charts. And basically it's a simple chart for those who are simply listening to the audio. It's just the price of dollars in Bitcoin. So it's basically an inverted style Bitcoin chart from what people are used to looking at. And so you see on a log scale, you just see this nice downward curve of the dollar. It has lost just an absolutely astounding amount of value against Bitcoin since Bitcoin got its first price in 2010. So at the beginning, the price was, somewhere in the range of, call it 20 Bitcoin per dollar or so. And today we are hovering at, about 1,000 Satoshis per dollar or a little less. So the dollar has really gone downhill, and there's also gray shading. So on the Fred charts, they like to put these gray rectangles on the chart, and these are supposed to show when there has been a recession in U.S. history, so you can kind of get a sense of how any given chart, how these metrics are playing along during these recession periods. But when we look at the USD against Bitcoin, it's much worse than recession. It's straight up hyperinflation. And if you want people can argue about, just as they argue about the definition of recessions, they can argue about hyperinflation. But broadly speaking, the standard economic definition by mainstream economists is that hyperinflation is a period of 30 plus days with a loss of 50+% value. So basically in this chart, all of the gray is where from an end point, the price the dollar has lost half its value, and so you can go back 30 days and see that over that period. And on this chart, it's sort of slowed down in terms of how many of these periods we've had over time, which kind of makes sense at the beginning. Obviously, Bitcoin was really skyrocketing. But it is something, even as late as 2024, we saw a period of a halving, not just of the Bitcoin subsidy, block subsidy, but also a halving of literally the dollar value of Bitcoin value of $1 within a single month. So that's a very rapid thing. And so I bring up this chart to show that hyperbitcoinization, if we want to think about it in terms of the fast depreciation of one currency or, the fast appreciation of another, here are events where by any standard economic way of looking at it, we've been seeing hyperinflation with the most powerful fiat currency in the world over the past 10 years, 15 years nearly. I guess there has been a full 15 years of price data at this point. And so this is happening. So I think this is just a good context to give when we're talking about this. This article itself, for those who are looking, it's way over here on the left. So there had already been a lot of these periods, but it was still very early on in the process. So I just wanted to bring that up. And Pierre, if you have anything to say about all of that I just laid out, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, I mean, people often ask, like, hey, so when is hyper-Bitcoinization actually going to happen? And aren't Bitcoiners in this regard very, it's almost like we're making a prediction of the apocalypse or something like that. But the reality is that hyper-Bitcoinization has already happened and will continue to happen. And so that's why, I always like to emphasize that hyper-Bitcoinization is real. And the challenge, I think, for folks is squaring that with, okay, but I'm not buying my Starbucks coffee with Bitcoin. Like, to them, that's their definition of hyper-Bitcoinization, right?
Yes. Yeah. That's sort of like, I know that this thing has completed when I can buy my Starbucks coffee. And I think this article actually, as we'll see, it kind of hits both notes, both ways of looking at hyper-Bitcoinization. Is it the singularity, the single event where Bitcoin just, becomes the dominant currency all at once? Or is it also more of this process? And to that, I say, yes, I think it's all of it. But I think you're right that people, in my opinion, people focus too much on that sort of end game moment to miss out on the real process of that happening. Because even with that sort of vision of things happening all at once, well, it's gradually then suddenly. And so when you have all that gradually, that's setting the stage for the suddenly. And so, and then the funny thing, of course, is that when we look at that chart, you might say that, oh, this has been gradually, but no, it's actually just suddenly then suddenly. It's just like, suddenly then suddenly like more suddenly is really how it feels. So, we can talk a little bit more about kind of how to think through that. But I think that's very true. And so I do want to point out this article has some artwork made by Daniel, and they have a fun illustrative style, and some people have thought it to be almost juvenile before, but I personally absolutely love the artwork. And if you're just listening, you should go click on the link to the show notes and see basically the main one. It's also the one that we used for the crash course, is a guy getting hit in the face with a Bitcoin just all of a sudden. It's just ramming him in the face, and I think it's just a perfect illustration of what happens, both in the sense of when you start learning about Bitcoin, so many people have the experience where it just hits them and they can't get enough. They just go down the rabbit holes immediately, and they become sort of addicted to like wanting to know everything they can. And then it's also, as we described in Speculative Attack and others, as Bitcoin starts to dominate, this is how also a lot of people are going to face Bitcoin. It's just going to come out of nowhere, and they're just going to have to deal with it. And So there's many different ways that you can get just smacked in the face by Bitcoin, and I think just all around it's a pretty good metaphor. So jumping into the article itself, Bitcoin-induced demonetization. This article is about the possibility of Bitcoin-induced currency demonetization, or hyperbitcoinization, which is what would happen to any hapless currency that stands in Bitcoin's path of total world domination. If this happens, the currency will rapidly lose value as Bitcoin supplants it. What would such an event be like, and how could it be understood economically? Comparison to hyperinflation. Demonetization refers to a process by which people cease to use a good as a currency, and hyperinflation is a kind of demonetization when the government inflates the currency at an accelerating pace. Hyperbitcoinization is a different kind, though it will appear superficially similar. In both kinds of events, prices in the doomed currency will skyrocket until it is no longer a currency at all. There are two essential differences between hyperinflation and hyperbitcoinization. The first is that a currency hyperinflates with restricted competition from other currencies, whereas hyperbitcoinization happens because of competition with Bitcoin. This is because capital controls are much more effective on other fiat currencies than on Bitcoin, so it is easy for Bitcoin to cross borders and compete with anything. The second is that in a hyperinflation, the government expands the money supply to outpace people's inflation expectations. Demonetization occurs as a result of their destructive interaction, whereas a hyperbitcoinization event need not be accompanied by any change in the supply of either currency. As the government forms a habit of inflating the money supply, its people form a habit of anticipating rising prices. This prevents the government from gaining as much each time it inflates. Thus, to get the same kick, the government must inflate more. The money loses value once people anticipate such heavy inflation that they can't spend it fast enough, and it no longer functions as a currency. Hyperinflation is an entrepreneurial act on the part of government, in the sense that it involves a continually changing intervention that prevents an equilibrium from forming. The government must continually alter its own behavior to stay ahead of its peoples. The moment they begin to anticipate its future policy, the government must change the policy by increasing the rate of inflation. Hyperbitcoinization is a voluntary transition from an inferior currency to a superior one, and its adoption is a series of individual acts of entrepreneurship rather than a single monopolist that games the system. So I think there's some important concepts here, because one of the things that we've heard over the years is effectively that Bitcoin is sort of, they'll say it's a hedge or an insurance against, crazy monetary policy or government spending or whatever. It's always put in those terms, and an implication of that, sometimes made more explicitly, but always kind of implied, is this idea that Bitcoin is only good within the case of the dollar failing, which I think underappreciates how good of a money Bitcoin actually is by virtue of just its properties, not only its monetary policy, but once it has that monetary policy, also its just ability to exist so well in an internet age. And so it's sort of a mistake I think, to view hyperinflation as the only kind of demonetization event that Bitcoin may deal with. Now, we look out at government spending and the debt crisis, and something like hyperinflation is not, it's not an insane concept to imagine as possible. People have seen their grocery bills skyrocket. They've seen their everything bills skyrocket to, some things, doubling in price over a few years, and some people having their more personal inflation rates upwards of 20% annual, 12 to 20%, which is very high and not quite what we said hyperinflation is by the sort of standard thing. But it's like that's an insane amount of inflation, especially when our beloved Federal Reserve System says that they're trying to target 2% inflation. You compound those numbers, and there's a big difference between 2% and 12%, especially over time. And so it's something that we should consider as a possibility, but we shouldn't consider it as the only possibility. And here, this helps us see that, if we believe Bitcoin is what it is, it's possible that the way that the dollar gets demonetized is not because it's inflated away, but because simply people don't want it anymore.
Yeah, I agree with that.
So, yeah, let's see. So an interesting point that I actually hadn't remembered this one until I went back to read this time. He has a line in here that in both kinds of events, whereas a hyperbitcoinization need not be accompanied by any change in the supply of either currency. That is to say that literally the government could stop printing altogether and Bitcoin could still win. And I think that's just such an important thing to think through the consequences of having Bitcoin in a fiat world. Which one is the better savings vehicle? Because fiat has shown itself, yes, the inflation rate is probably the main driver of people seeking out alternative places to park their money. But we've also had time and time again all kinds of reasons that people have started to better understand the importance of having independence from effectively political management of money at all. And so those are also something to consider. And I think it's just important to think beyond the doomsday, while not saying that doesn't have a possibility at all, but be able to think beyond it as well.
Yeah, I think otherwise we get accused of being doomers, right? Which we certainly don't want. But also that, when we look at the critique of Bitcoin is a zero interest rate policy phenomenon, that if the government was actually responsible or if interest rates were higher, then Bitcoin's value proposition goes away. And the reality is that interest rates went up from 0% to 4.5%. And I think it did slow down Bitcoin adoption, but it did not stop it or even reverse it. And so I think that there's more to it than just people trying to escape the dollar system.
Yes, agreed. And, their long-term inflation rate is not 0%. So obviously, if they literally decide to just halt everything, that would be a big change to what we have now, and it would probably have some effect on the rate of Bitcoin adoption. But even if they just we're back at our target of 2%, and this applies to gold as well, since the gold supply increases at a roughly 2%. That doesn't sound like much year over year, but when you compound that, it only takes 30-something years to halve the purchasing power of any given amount of those monies. And so when we've already stated that savings is such an important part of kind of setting the fundamental values of a monetary economy, when you're eating away at savings that much, that is a huge blow. And so Bitcoin 0% is going to be 2% over a long enough time period. So continuing on, whoops, you just got Bitcoined. Based on these two differences, I make two predictions about a hyper-Bitcoinization event. One, a hyper-Bitcoinization event will be much quicker than a hyperinflation event. I have two reasons for this. First, the government will have a much greater difficulty preventing Bitcoins from entering the country due to the impotency of capital controls upon it. Second, hyperinflation is inherently an attempt to fool people, whereas hyperbitcoinization is quite regular and predictable, at least by comparison. Therefore, people will more easily see that they had better switch over. Thus, as fast as hyperinflation is, hyperbitcoinization will be even faster. It will happen much faster than you expect. So I actually, admittedly, I don't know enough about the history of hyperinflation events to make a good call on this time frame. So I don't know that I can agree or disagree strongly with the idea that it would be quicker than a hyperinflation event. What I can say is that I think a hyperbitcoinization event happens much quicker than people think a hyperbitcoinization event would look like. And that event, I could also, just say it's, the process as well. We see, even just technology broadly, we see this sort of acceleration of just how fast new technologies can grow tremendous amounts, new adoption. The latest in this has been ChatGPT, which I forget how many users there are now, but it's in the tens of millions, and that happened over the course of, I think, like a few months at the beginning for that first big bump. And so, the adoption of a new technology when it's recognized to be so useful, which obviously a sound money is eminently useful, especially when it is allowing you to, retain the value and purchasing power of your hard-earned labor, and has that sweet, number go up technology. There's no reason that also can't have the same speed. And then, based on what we were saying earlier, I would say that's already been happening, and we would just expect it to continue to happen even more and more. And so, in some ways, at the beginning of our journey through this, we kind of actually overestimated how fast this would happen. But in hindsight, 15 years to get to from zero to $2 trillion is quite extraordinary.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, you'd have to be high time preference to argue otherwise.
Which, as college students, I suppose we were.
100%.
So we'll go ahead and cover the second one. So number 2, hyperbitcoinization will not disrupt the economy to nearly the same degree as hyperinflation. The currency is the instrument of the division of labor, and hyperinflation makes it unreliable and forces people to use worse alternatives. In a hyperbitcoinization event, people switch from a fundamentally inferior currency to a superior one, whereas in a hyperinflationary event, people will only switch to a new currency once the old currency becomes worse than the next best alternative, such as gold or detergent. Hyperbitcoinization should be accompanied by a rapid improvement in productivity and wealth. And just for context, because this is definitely like a historical throwback, the detergent comment is because at the time, maybe it was like a year or two, maybe 3 before this article was written, there had been a rise in use by certain, I think it was gangs and maybe some drug cartels that were making use of Tide detergent because they effectively found that it was a better store of value than the cash that they were dealing with. And so Tide was the store of value of choice for these people. So your money's not doing so well when Tide is a better store of value. I guess it's good for money laundering. This is where a key thing comes in, and where the process, when people are, when Bitcoin, hyperbitcoinization is occurring, which, as we would say, is like, it already is real. It is happening. Hyperbitcoinization is not merely like some cataclysmic event where, the skies open up and then everyone goes from not using Bitcoin to everyone using Bitcoin, just, in some kind of strange external way. It's actually happening in that whole process. along the entire way, it's happening at the margins. It's that every single person at some point sees Bitcoin. They see what value it has at that time. They see what expectations they have of its value into the future relative to the other things. And they decide to hold a larger or smaller cash balance of Bitcoin than previously. And this is all happening at the margins. And what we call hyperbitcoinization, whether it's that process or that sort of like maybe some kind of end stage event, both are actually based on just the outcome of those marginal individual activities. And what happens with such a sort of cataclysmic event is similar to with hyperinflation, where you have the crack up boom, where effectively everyone has caught on so much to what's going on that everyone is able to recognize that this money is no longer good to be used as money because of its, all of the printing and how it's going to have no value, not even just tomorrow, but literally later in the day, that everyone immediately ditches it and they run all over for all sorts of other goods. And this is actually probably one of the horrible things about hyperinflation is that it tends to be the case that when you have a hyperinflation, it's not as though you have some alternative currencies sitting there waiting for you to pick it up. There might be gold, but it might be extremely hard to even get your hands on gold. There's, in the sense that there's not even necessarily a liquid enough market in that place and time for it to all go down. Whereas with Bitcoin, people, as he's saying, they're not having to flee a dead currency that's been hyperinflated, although that could happen. But in either case, the thing that they're picking up as they leave it, as they start to find Bitcoin, they are choosing a fundamentally better money. And so the real societal collapse around hyperinflation is less of a concern, I think, with Bitcoin, even if you have a hyperinflationary event in conjunction with hyperbitcoinization occurring, because of the fact that it's an actually functional, highly liquid money available for use at the time of need. In fact, I would say that, Bitcoin is, and sound money, you could say in general, is a sort of economic load balancer. So it's like all those people at the margins, they feel different kinds of uncertainty and they balance that out with a different cash balance of Bitcoin. And whenever there is an event where people have more and more of a felt uncertainty, Bitcoin, it's a global 24/7 highly liquid market. The price may go up as a part of that load balancing, but Bitcoin will continue to, go about its business exactly the same. And so it is just everyone is upgrading rather than dealing with a doomsday scenario when you're talking about just adopting Bitcoin. And I think this is just probably one of the more important takeaways from this article.
Yep, I agree.
So, hyperbitcoinization will probably be a confusing time for everyone, like a second adolescence. However, once it is over, no one will be able to imagine how we got by with the earlier system. And another piece of artwork is there's a mad scientist looking guy with floating Bitcoin, and he says, "My body, it's actually turning into Bitcoin." And I think this is a very funny look at just like the feeling of being washed over with Bitcoin and just really starting to see the full potential of Bitcoin and actually really embedding oneself in a Bitcoin economy and enjoying the fruits of it. It really is a life-changing experience for many. Pierre, do you have any other thoughts on hyperbitcoinization?
Well, I think that there is that gradually then suddenly kind of view that, okay, we have this diminishing marginal returns where, as you mentioned at the beginning, the hyper-Bitcoinization events are happening less and less frequently. But isn't there a tipping point where eventually, like, you get enough adoption to where the dollar goes to zero, and so you have that final period of hyper-Bitcoinization? And I really think that it depends on the government, and that if the government adopts Bitcoin as a reserve asset, then no, you don't have that final capitulation, because now they've backed it with Bitcoin.
Yeah, it's
but
like
you could argue that's it, right? Like the final hyper-Bitcoinization is the government adopting it.
Yeah, in which they've capitulated and deemed Bitcoin the best, but also are making it easier for legacy dollar users to deal with deprecated currencies until they also make the switch in a more explicit way. Yeah, it's like almost is like the does the government itself choose to use Bitcoin as its economic load balancer? Because if they don't, through all of these speculative attacks and so on and so forth, they're probably going to get wrecked almost inevitably. And so, but if they start kind of load balancing their own treasury with Bitcoin, they can use that to their advantage to try to kind of dampen the blows. Something that I wanted to discuss, I think you had a recent tweet basically on this, suggesting that, governments, if they were acting as sort of giant Bitcoin treasury companies, they should be issuing more of their currency to buy more Bitcoin, and that this would be a path to get onto a Bitcoin standard.
Yeah, and I think that one of the responses was, well, if they did that, then the money would immediately go to zero. And I don't think that's true. You see governments print lots of money, and it's often surprising how people continue to use a government currency even after hyperinflation, and people really stick to it. So I think that not only that, but the other part is that I don't think it would cause hyperinflation. I don't think there would be an immediate loss of confidence. I think that it would be a gradual process of the value of Bitcoin increasing relative to the fiat currency until they have printed enough dollars to buy enough Bitcoin so that they've gotten to a point where every dollar out there is backed by some quantity of Bitcoin. And then it really becomes a matter of, well, okay, now we have a new economy, because you still have the same principle that, okay, the banking system cannot create more dollars to lend out, because they need to have the Bitcoin to back that. And so you would have, I think, a situation where the interest rate is floating and the exchange rate it's fixed, and you've essentially run the history timeline backwards on how we got off of the gold standard. And people would say, well, okay, why would that happen? We got off the gold standard due to natural pressures. Why would you get back onto a Bitcoin standard? And I think the reason why that would happen is really simple, which is that Bitcoin's better than gold. And so I think we got off the gold standard because of the tremendous transactional costs of moving gold around, combined with the fact that it's not as scarce as Bitcoin is. And so if you lower the cost of custodying your own asset, like what Bitcoin does relative to gold, you get to a point where it actually does make sense that people are wanting to use Bitcoin instead of dollars, whereas in the past they'd rather use dollars instead of gold.
Yeah, our friend Saifedean talks a lot about the sort of BRICS bluffing, where they try to make it seem like they're going to make some gold-backed BRICS currency, and he always talks about it as like monetary policy by press release or something, where they talk about it, but it's like, well, if you actually want to do that because it's gold, it's like you have to actually, you need the gold vault, you need all of the like actual ways of moving gold around, and who's going to hold the gold and so on and so forth. And it's a lot of infrastructure that has to actually be built, and you can't simply say words and have it built. Even the fiat system, has a lot of piping, built-in cobalt and stuff to make function. And so when you compare that with Bitcoin is just right there. And so if people wanted to make a more independent money, it's like, well, there's already a perfect one there, very trivial to run. I mean, running a node, they can get a little mini PC if they really want to be spicy. They can try that on a Raspberry Pi, but you don't need much hardware. Any nation, no matter how big it is, could go grab an old laptop and start running Bitcoin Core and have a connection into a new monetary system. And so it's much easier to rapidly adopt than a gold standard. What I thought was interesting about your tweet, though, was that it's similar and yet so different from a path or a policy prescription by Ludwig von Mises that he gave I think it was in the 50s as a way to get to the gold standard. And it's actually very similar in that it's basically the goal is to allow the market to set the proper price of dollars against gold instead of the government trying to create that by fiat, allow their gold reserves to just find a natural market price. And so with that, though, they don't print new dollars to buy Bitcoin per se. I mean, to buy gold per se. What happens is they stop all additional printing that doesn't have full reserve, and then any additional dollars that they would add from there has to be backed by gold. And so over time, the proportion of the reserve backed by gold, especially with the changing price, kind of it finds that equilibrium to the point where at the end you effectively have a gold-backed currency and the country is back on a gold standard. So it's somewhat different, but the key thing that I think is somewhat similar, very similar, but I think where the key difference is literally like, do you print to go buy Bitcoin, or do you halt the printing and go full reserve Bitcoin from there? And actually, as I think about that, is your argument actually even closer to it than I thought, because you are issuing new money, but you're using it to buy Bitcoin, so you are like effectively backing it.
Yeah, I would argue that's the only case where the government should allow itself to issue new money is to buy Bitcoin. They should not do it to go spend.
Yeah, so it'd actually be a way to just strengthen the reserves. Obviously, it does make the dollar amount, like the dollar price of Bitcoin, go up. So each unit of dollars would be worth fewer and fewer sats. And so I suppose one could argue that would have a, unfortunate effect for the people still using dollars. The government would be helping its own reserves, but those people would still be
their sats per dollar would increase. Right.
That's true.
So, like, that's I think the lens to look at it through is that they would actually benefit from that, even if they don't like Bitcoin or whatever.
Yeah. Do you see any sort of Misesian downsides to this? In what way might a libertarian, besides just the government doing something, just from an economic point of view and the trade-offs involved here, who would be winning, who would be losing?
Well, if let's say instead of doing that, they cut spending, right? Cut spending so much that they were running a surplus, and then they used the surplus to buy Bitcoin to back the existing dollars. I just don't think that's realistic that they would run a surplus, right? Nothing stops this train, as they say.
Right. So, but do you think that it creates any additional losers when the government is purchasing this Bitcoin?
Well, the dollar holders were going to lose, right? They were gonna lose 100%. Now they're gonna lose like 95%. So,
I see. Because of the fact that the underlying reserves of that dollar are increasing in value thanks to the Satoshis being bought by the government.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I kind of answered my own question though, realizing that it's actually in many ways more aligned with the Indian prescription than I thought. I'll be sure to share a link in the show notes. People can do the comparison for themselves and think through it. In any case, I mean, so hyperbitcoinization, this term has, it's actually funny to me. I have this little, I'm just humbled every time I see the word hyperbitcoinization, especially when the further disconnected it is to anything to do with the Satoshi Nakamoto Institute. Just the fact that it is a word that is embedded into the popular lexicon. It's pretty incredible. And so, I think it's great that term, I think it's great that the term is out there. So there's always there as a sort of, mimetic grounding, like it can, normalize in people's minds the idea that this can happen, which is good because it's the reality of what's happening. And it's good for people to be aligned with reality.
Yeah, I agree.
So, yeah, I think, it's a short article and it kind of speaks for itself. But, my big takeaways is it's already happening. It's going to continue to happen. And it's a good thing. I view it as it's a very good thing. And the doomer scenarios, insofar as it's doomy, is because of the fallout of fiat and perhaps some limitations that Bitcoin might have in actually getting people back up and running, rather than Bitcoin itself. I don't think that...
what I was going to say is that this just ties into the conversation about the initial distribution, right? Like, yeah, in an ideal world, everybody who's holding dollars in 2009 gets airdropped a proportional quantity of Bitcoin, and then, we're done. But that's impossible.
Yes, but there's also, it's like, I don't think that Bitcoin going to the moon, people say, because you even have had skeptics that have basically had this position. It's like, well, if that happened with Bitcoin, the dollar would collapse and we'd all be, dying in the streets. And the problem is just, I think this helps us understand how that second part of that is just totally false. Or rather, it's like it doesn't follow. It's a non sequitur, because yes, there might be dollar demonetization depending on how well different governments back their reserves with Bitcoin. But that demonetization does not inherently mean everyone's dying in the streets, because that is only a particular kind of demonetization where people are losing. There is a collapse of, it's not just a collapse of a money, there's just a collapse of money. Whereas with Bitcoin, it is hyperbitcoinization is demonetizing the dollar. That is, demonetization is happening because people are moving on to other things. So getting mad about it, it's like, it kind of reminds me of, Bastiat's like Candlemakers petition, where all of the the candle makers are mad at the sun for taking their business. And of course, like into the future, you have, people with light bulbs, now you don't need as many candles. And it's like, well, when you have Bitcoin, you no longer need fiat. And so people just leave it behind. And we see that with all kinds of technologies, and it's not the end of civilization. If anything, it's like, a beginning of a new era. So I think those skeptics are just totally wrong. And hyperbitcoinization it's positive in the fact that it's actually happening, and it's positive in the sense that it is people literally getting onto a better tool for economic calculation and the coordination of a division of labor, which means that the economy that chooses to grow with Bitcoin, start adopting Bitcoin, is going to grow and become more productive rather than less, because they now have a money that can actually handle that, unlike fiat.
Yep, I agree.
All right. Well, thank you for joining me. We have one more episode of the Mempool Crash Course series. We will be discussing Everyone's a Scammer.
That's the most important one.
That's my personal addition to the actual typed words of the mempool crash course. I did the publishing, but this will be my personal written edition. So looking forward to discussing my own article and talking about basically, in hindsight of this, everything we've discussed so far is what mindset do you need going forward now that you recognize that hyperbitcoinization is real. So I look forward to that, and we'll see you then. Thank you, Pierre.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you for listening to The Reorg. This podcast is brought to you by the Satoshi Nakamoto Institute, dedicated to advancing and preserving Bitcoin knowledge. Our mission is to deepen understanding and appreciation of Bitcoin, not just for today, but for generations to come, by creating enduring educational resources and generational knowledge for generational wealth. If you enjoyed the show, please support our work by sharing links, deepening your own Bitcoin knowledge by exploring and studying the S&I archives, and contributing sats. As a 501c3 nonprofit, we rely entirely on supporters like you. Whether you can give a few Satoshis or a few thousand Bitcoins, your contributions enable us to continue educating current and future Bitcoiners worldwide.